Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for some of you, that may be good morning or good evening. Thank you all for joining me today for the third of our Columbia CBIPS lectures on the AEC experience relating to COVID-19. I'm Fenioski Peñamora, Director of the Columbia Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space, and a professor at Columbia's Full Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. Our lecture program will continue every Tuesday at noon into September. There will be 19 talks altogether, focusing on leaders in both the public sector and the private sector. Our first three speakers are all working in municipal government in New York, but with the fourth lecture, we will reach out to a distinguished leader in private practice. And with the fifth talk, start to broaden the lens and reach out to our colleagues working on sustainability and transportation infrastructure issues on Los Angeles. Please check our website to see more information about our next speaker and my co-moderators. I would also especially like to thank the organizations with whom we are collaborating in presenting these lectures. They are the American Council of Engineering Companies, New York, thanks Jay Simpson. The American Institute of Architects, New York chapter, thanks Ben Prosky. The American Society of Civil Engineers, thanks Ben Walpole and Tom Smith. The Construction Management Association of America, New York, New Jersey, thanks Vinnie Folkowski. Engineering News Record, thanks Jan Tuckman, who is also the co-moderator and the participating today. And the National Academy of Construction, thanks Wayne Crew. Today, I'm pleased that Jan Tuckman has joined me by Zoom to be co-moderator and respondent. Jan is the editor-in-chief at Engineering News Record and a board member of the advisory board of the Center for Buildings, Infrastructure, and Public Space. Welcome, Jan. Our speaker today, thank you. Our speaker today, the third speaker in the series, is Danielle Zarrilli, Chief Climate Policy Advisor and OneNYC Director in the New York City Office of the Mayor. The title of Danielle's talk is Putting Climate at the Heart of COVID-19 Recovery. We will be hearing how, amid this ongoing health crisis, we cannot lose sight of our looming climate crisis and the impacts it will cause to public health and well-being. Instead, we can choose to emerge stronger and more resilient for this crisis with a green recovery that prioritizes clean energy, infrastructure, job creation, and environmental justice. Investing in clean energy and resilient infrastructure over the next decade will spur our nation's economy and create enormous numbers of jobs, good paying jobs, and accessible jobs at just the right moment to align with the scientific demands of our climate crisis and the needs of an American economy that is suffering its worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Mr. Zarrilli is licensed professional engineer at New York and holds an MS in civil and environmental engineering from MIT and a BS in civil engineering from Lehigh University. As New York City Chief Climate Policy Advisor and OneNYC Director, Danielle Zarrilli is preparing America's largest city for the future of delivering on New York City Green New Deal. Under Danielle's leadership, New York City recently released its newest long-term strategic plan, OneNYC 2050, which includes bold new actions to confront our climate crisis and achieve equity. You can see his full bio online on the CBIPS website. Thank you for being here with us today, Danielle. And Danielle, can you please, you can take the floor and start your presentation.
Fantastic. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, Fanny, and with Jan and Rick and Charles. Thanks for organizing this session and this entire speaker series. And hope everyone out there in Zoom land is doing well, and everyone's families is doing well through this crisis. I'm going to share my screen and talk you through a little bit about how New York City is thinking about this moment. And I'm going to anchor it first in the strategic plan that Fenioski mentioned, the OneNYC 2050 plan, and the thinking that went into the targets and goals and initiatives that we put forward last April for really thinking through all the great challenges that face New York City. And I'm going to focus specifically on some of the climate-centered aspects of that plan. And then we'll talk a little bit about what it means in this moment, because of course, a lot of things are being thrown into some real uncertainty. This is a really traumatic and difficult moment for New York City and for cities around the world. But as you mentioned, Fenny, the need to not lose sight of our looming climate crisis at this moment, when we know it will also cause strains to public health, to well-being. We can't think that we're going to recover from this crisis by ignoring the next and perhaps even bigger one that's coming at us over the horizon. So let me dive into this first. Just a little. Make sure I can make this work. A little bit about just this COVID moment, of course, and you know, some of this is a little bit of public service announcement from New York City, and you know, we are going through really just an unbelievable trauma during this coronavirus crisis, and you know, we're seeing impacts all over the city. Personally, the staggering loss of life. You know, the estimates are at over 20,000 New Yorkers have lost their lives from this. The strains on our healthcare system have been pretty apparent, and the surge capacity has been tested. Thankfully, it seems like we are past the peak of this, and that's because of all the great things that people have done to social distance and really be part of working together to get the transmission rates on this disease down. And, you know, we need to keep doing that in order to make sure that we can come out of this. But of course, the jobs and economic losses are real at this moment, and the support for small businesses needs to continue. We're going to need to see a lot of job as part of an accelerated economic recovery from this, particularly in areas like retail and tourism and the creative sectors, and some of the sectors in New York City that have seen the most losses and the most lack of spending and the job losses. And of course, you know, we could probably continue this list with all the different impacts that are happening. And so, you know, all of this, we're going to need to continue all the short-term health and economic response and recovery programs through this, as we're thinking about how the reactivation of different sectors of our economy is happening and what it means to unpause and still control this virus with contact tracing and testing and all of the public health that's necessary for that. But, you know, the guidance still is, you know, stay home and social distance. And so first things first, you know, want to just share the message, and here's a couple resources. If anyone hasn't been taking advantage of these, to visit nyc.gov/coronavirus or to text COVID to 692-692 to stay on top of all the latest information and guidance that's coming out from the city. So I just wanted to start with a little PSA there. Of course, you know, this moment has thrown us into a lot of uncertainty, but I wanted to take us back at least to think about what it is that we did with OneNYC in 2050. And in April 2019, we took stock of all of the challenges that face our city, and whether that's economically, the health and wealth inequities across our city, all the numbers of New Yorkers that are rent burdened, like the full spectrum of challenges that we face in our city. And this plan was really put forward to think about these over the next several decades and put a vision forward for the kind of city that we're trying to build. It really boils down to three key themes that we put forward in this plan. One is about confronting our climate crisis and preparing for all the growing sort of global risks that are coming. And that includes public health risks. That includes a whole range of enterprise risk to New York City. And again, climate is not going away just because we're facing this current crisis, and we need to get through this and in a way that helps us think through that next one. We'll spend a lot of time on that in this over the next hour. But the plan also about addressing health and wealth inequities across the city and really bringing all New Yorkers into the civic life of the city and strengthening our democracy. There's so many of our problems as a city that we don't fix if we don't fix the challenges in our democracy nationally, globally, and certainly right here at home, and bringing more New Yorkers into this, into the process. And so when we laid out this plan, we did so across 8 key themes. You see these sort of goal statements that we have here. We're trying to build a vibrant democracy, an inclusive economy, thriving neighborhoods, and so on. These really were the touchstone across the entirety of the spectrum of this plan, thinking about, you know, what this city needs to look like in 2050, given all the trends that we are facing. And that, you know, on the bottom line there, a livable climate took center stage, really thinking about how the things we need to do to make sure that we're turning over a city that we can be proud of and make sure that we're building a livable future for the next generation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But first, for those of you who aren't, you know, neck deep in all the climate science like some of us are, you know, we've already seen the impacts of climate change here in New York City. whether it was Hurricane Sandy or an increase in heat that we're having here in New York City, we've already seen the impacts, and it's only projected to get worse. The New York City Panel on Climate Change that we work with in New York City, which is made up of a group of regional and really esteemed climate scientists that have been projecting the impacts of climate change for over a decade here in New York City, they're telling us that it's going to get, on average, warmer. We're going to see more precipitation, more rain, and across the city. It's also going to come in more intense bouts, and we're going to have a higher likelihood of more intense storms, and that is true of rainstorms. That's true of coastal storms as well. Sea level rise is continuing to rise. We've already seen a foot of sea level rise since 1900 in New York City. The mid-range of the projections in 2050 is that it could be another 1 to 2 feet higher, maybe as high as 2.5 feet. Of course, it doesn't stop there. Our projections go out to 2100 at this point, where we're seeing it could be, the high end of the projections could be above 6 feet across the city, which is really just a wildly transformed coastal environment in a city like New York, where we have 520 miles of coastline. And then triple the number of days above 90 degrees. Heat is continuing to be the largest killer of any natural hazard in New York City every year. And more heat waves means more days when we're running more air conditioning. We're seeing the impacts of that and already putting forward plans for this summer, when we need to be thinking about heat in the context of COVID and social distancing. And the city is putting out and paying for air conditioners and looking for relief from the Public Service Commission for helping to pay for the air conditioning that's needed for our most vulnerable seniors. So we have a lot of climate impacts that are already happening, and they're changing in this moment, but they're certainly not going away. And it's helpful, I think, just to have a quick snapshot of where our greenhouse gas emissions that are driving these changes are coming from. I think a lot of folks on this call would know that buildings account for about 2/3 of the city's greenhouse gas emissions, and about half of that is in heat and hot water. In that sector, transportation, about 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and private vehicles account for the bulk of that. And then waste is a smaller but important sliver that's largely driven by landfill methane. And I think this sort of pie chart would look very different in other cities that rely more on cars for getting around, that don't have as extensive mass transit system. But here in New York City, it's buildings that account for the bulk of our greenhouse gas emissions, which explains some of the recent focus on building retrofit mandates and updated building codes for buildings, and really pushing towards something that looks a lot more like a net zero standard for buildings in the years to come. And the good news, of course, is that New York City has peaked its emissions, and our most recently published information on New York City emissions data shows that we're still trending downward. But the bad news is that as a globe, emissions continue to go up. And so while cities, and a lot of cities around the world, have peaked their emissions, we're continuing to see on a global level that emissions continue to go higher and higher. And so when we think about the risks we face and what we've already locked in terms of climate changes, what we do is important, but we need to also set a good example and get others to do the same sort of actions, because that global number ultimately needs to peak and come down if we're going to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and really hold warming to 1.5 degrees, at which point, we can at least hopefully manage the changes we've already put in place. So just a little, I think, a helpful context on where our emissions are coming from and what we're seeing here in New York City. And so when we put out OneNYC in 2050, wanting to make sure that we are continuing to drive our emissions down, we set some key targets. One is that we want to achieve carbon neutrality, and a big part of that is going to be securing 100% clean electricity for New York City. That's going to require more electric vehicles, retrofitting our buildings. There's a lot to be said about congestion pricing in this moment, but it's still critically important, and maybe even more important in this moment, that we get that right. But we also need to make sure that we're strengthening our resiliency, and the changes that we're already seeing in our climate aren't going to go away. We want to make sure it's not getting any worse, but that's going to mean that we need to adapt and deliver coastal protection projects, heat mitigation measures, the full range of adaptation measures across our city. And for us, it also means fighting for climate accountability and justice, which is driving our work to divest from fossil fuels. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a bit. And increasing civic engagement around climate and climate literacy, working with our schools to teach kids and the next generation about climate, and making sure that this is creating economic opportunities. And in this particular COVID moment, this is, I think, one of the most important points is the ability to accelerate an economic recovery by investing in the jobs of the future, the clean energy jobs that we need. With our building retrofit mandates, we're already estimated to be creating tens of thousands of jobs in energy efficiency. Well, that can be a model for a whole lot more that can be particularly useful in this moment when unemployment is so high and rising. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on that bolded item, the secure 100% clean electricity, and just share a couple data points around how the city is thinking about achieving that and the difficulty in doing that and what it's actually going to take. Before going a little bit into divestment and then talking more deeply about what all this means in this moment and what a green recovery might look like in this moment as well. So in OneNYC, we set a target again of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, and this does require ending our reliance on fossil fuels, and that's a massive undertaking to really fully electrify our city, transforming our city's buildings, energy, transportation, waste sectors. All of it needs to be rethought in this moment to really think about how to get ourselves off of fossil fuels, electrify the city, and make sure that electricity is all renewable, solar, wind, hydropower. To be able to supply the city's energy needs and secure the long-term resilience of our energy as well. And so let's talk a little bit about what our energy looks like in New York City. This is New York State's electricity mix. There's good clean electricity in here. There is good renewables in here. That nuclear number, of course, is going to be going down as Indian Point is closing, and so that's going to put a little extra strain on our work here, but fossil fuels still account for about 46% of the state's electricity mix. Most of that is generated from natural gas. Now, there's a story of two grids here in New York City. Upstate, a whole lot cleaner than it is downstate, partly due to in-city generation requirements, partly due to transmission constraints. And so as a result, about 2/3 of New York City's electricity comes from fossil fuels. Well, when Indian Point closes, that number is actually going to go up even higher, and that's going to have negative pollution and air quality impacts here in New York City as well. And so this is partly why we're doing so much to make sure that we're cutting our energy use with the mandatory building retrofits, securing clean electricity, working to divest from fossil fuels, and supporting all the local investments we need in renewables like rooftop solar, offshore wind, and continuing to oppose projects like the Williams Pipeline. And increasing that work through the most recent State of the City announcements that the mayor made around rooftop solar, offshore wind at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, and signing an executive order putting in place our policy that we are opposing new fossil fuel infrastructure that expands the supply of fossil fuels into the city, which is world leading in its own right, and we're going to be doing a lot of work to take that even further. But when you do all that, so the modeling that we've done here in New York City, when we build in all the additional energy efficiency that's coming from the building retrofit mandates, the thousands of megawatts of offshore wind, more in-city solar, the Canadian hydro that we're looking to secure, all the storage that's needed, we are still looking over the next 10 years that fossil fuels could make up still 36% of our electricity grid. Just to show you the scale of the challenge that we're facing, that we're moving all of these pieces forward. We're setting really aggressive targets, and we need to be 100% clean electricity by 2040 in order to make sure we're doing our part to help achieve the Paris Agreement. Well, by 2030, we're still going to have a long way to go on that. And so that's one of the reasons why we are going after something like Canadian hydropower that's been really important to New York City. It's a clean, reliable source of energy that can provide that baseload power that we need in New York City, and importantly, offsetting the local generation that's happening here that causes a lot of air quality problems and environmental justice problems here in the city. We can get a lot of great extra energy resiliency benefits from this and black start capabilities, and it's something that in all the clean energy that we can get our hands on, it's one of the most near-term items that we can do. And the mayor's been committed and still committed to getting to a deal on this And thinking about how all that works in this moment, of course, is opening up some complications, but this is something that the city needs to figure out in order to be part of our 100% clean electricity solution. And this is something that we're doing in a way that's going to be respecting the rights of First Nations, not inundating new parts of Canada. There's been a lot of concerns from Indigenous organizations and First Nations around how this happens, but what we've been seeing is that there is existing hydropower available. No new inundation is needed to supply New York City's needs, and that's why it makes a ton of sense for us to be pursuing this. Ultimately, failure to get that 36% number down even further means that we're going to end up burning more natural gas, and we know that natural gas, with its methane leakage, is continuing to heat the planet. That it's also burning it here in the city is causing air quality problems, environmental injustices here in New York City, and it's something that we need to get ourselves past. And so this is a big part of how we're working to get ourselves off fossil fuels, and it's by no means an easy task, but things like offshore wind and solar and hydro are the path to doing that, and we need to make sure that we're building the infrastructure to support that, including the transmission that's required to deliver that power here into the city. The other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is just what we're doing on divestment. And this has been a long-term trend that fossil fuels continue to underperform the market, and knowing that the outlook is going to continue to be poor, that there's a risk of stranded assets, and we've seen the most recent crash in oil prices, it's become even more stark, that this is not just something we're doing because it's the right thing to do, it's financially responsible action for our retirees as well. Which is why that we committed in 2018 that we're going to divest our pension funds from fossil fuels by 2022, and we're still on target to deliver an actionable divestment plan to the trustees of our pension funds by the end of this year. And it's not just about saying no to fossil fuels in this, it's also about continuing to say yes to the renewable energy that we need. And we've made a commitment, and working with the Controller's Office, we're doubling our current investment into climate solutions, things like energy efficiency, renewable energy, wind, solar, from what was $2 billion as part of our pension investments up to about $4 billion, or 2% of our assets under management, to be able to help drive the solution towards the Paris Agreement. And this divest invest action is resonating well around the world. We've actually come together with the mayor of London to call on other cities to divest from fossil fuels, as well as providing the resources on how to do that with a new toolkit that we released in January in partnership with C40 cities. And we've been doing a lot of work helping other cities think through how to move past this from commitment into action. And we've got a lot of cities that are working with us on this, seeing the, really seeing the future of fossil fuels, going away, ending the age of fossil fuels, and making sure that we're aligning our investments to help spur that transition in a just way towards new sources of energy that creates new jobs all across this country. And so getting to this point around what this means in this moment of COVID-19, of course. So again, we are very much seeing continuing impacts, economic, health-related, all across the city. And the mayor, and in partnership with C40 cities, a number of cities across the globe have come together to establish a set of recovery principles to make sure that we are not just going back to the status quo. The status quo wasn't working for a lot of reasons, and we want to make sure that we are cognizant of the threats that are still coming at us over the horizon. We need to make sure that we've got a recovery that takes us away from that track of warming the planet, and is guided by the best health and scientific expertise, and really puts climate action at the heart of our COVID recovery to create the jobs, to enhance environmental justice, and to promote clean energy of the type that we are going to continue to need more and more of as we think about what it means to get past fossil fuels that have really powered our economy for so long, but now have proven themselves to be causing the challenges we have with our climate crisis. And so it really needs a collective voice coming from cities and coming from all of us to show that this recovery can create the kind of jobs that are necessary to help get out of this crisis, and to really spur the economic recovery in a way that's fair, healthy, and sustainable. So I want to provide just first a little context on the kinds of things we're doing as New York City and what it means in this moment. A few of you may have seen, we published out of our office an op-ed in Gotham Gazette on Earth Day, sort of making a lot of these points around the need to really have the courage to seize this moment for acting on climate. It's not an easy thing. We need federal help. We see other governments across the world that are taking this moment, whether it's the EU, whether we're seeing things out of the IMF and the World Bank, that they're recognizing that the kind of investment that we need to create jobs in a moment like this, the best way to do that is going to be through green infrastructure, resilient infrastructure that help protect us from the risks that are coming, as well as head off those risks by greening as much of our economy as is possible. And I think it's a really powerful moment to think about this and really seize that opportunity. So with this, this is how New York City is thinking about securing that livable future for the next generation. I think this full spectrum of action around getting to 100% clean energy, carbon neutrality, greening our buildings, our transportation, our waste, our energy systems, and making sure we're protecting our residents from the risks that are already locked in. This is going to be the path, and this is really a key moment to make sure that we can leverage the investment that's going to be happening as part of this recovery to head off that next looming crisis that does face New York City and really all of us across the globe. So with that, I'm going to, I think, pass this back to Rick and Jan for moderating on this, but I want to provide a little context on how we're thinking about things in New York City. And hopefully this has been helpful. And then I know there's going to be a lot of questions on this about what we're doing and how to make this real in this particular moment. So with that, let me turn it back to Jan and Rick.
Muted. We got oh, there. I'm unmuted. Fanny, shall I go ahead with the first?
Yes, please go with the first questions.
Daniel, that was thank you so much. That was like a really, really good overview of what's happening in New York City with a lot of interesting data. But I'd ask you to sort of, if you could go in another layer and talk a little more about, you brought up definitely this really interesting phenomena that we're seeing, blue skies in Los Angeles and blue skies in Beijing and maybe bluer skies in New York City. So that it does seem like and I don't know if you can say that there's any silver lining to COVID, and to a pandemic with all the lives that have been lost, but we have seen some gains on the climate picture. And I wondered if you'd seen any data on that, either whether it's international, national, or local. And then is there any way to, and you talked about this a little bit, but if you could talk more about the strategy to hang on to any gains that we've accomplished. Not accomplished, it just happened because of, as an offshoot of the terrible situation.
Right, and I think, this question comes up a lot around, this sort of, I'm not a big fan of the silver lining term myself, just of, no one would have, certainly, we all want cleaner air, we all want greenhouse gas emissions to go down. This is not how we want it to happen. We want to do it in a way that, doesn't have this disruption to the economy, to lives, to livelihoods. We certainly have seen improvements in air quality. And I think some of the numbers that I've seen in New York City, somewhere between 20 and 30% reduction in PM 2.5, and that has a real, real impact on air and air quality and health. And it is particularly in those neighborhoods where, we're also seeing a lot of impacts from COVID. There's been some really interesting research on, the neighborhoods where we have higher levels of PM 2.5 is also where we have higher death rates and cases of COVID. And, some of that I think there's still a lot to be learned about that, whether it's causation, correlation, I don't fully know. I'm not studying it as deeply, but it seems like there's an overlay of the kinds of neighborhoods where we see higher levels of poverty, people working jobs that may be more in the essential services and therefore aren't able to stay at home, are also neighborhoods where we may have more environmental injustices and worse air quality. And so there's some really interesting overlays of air quality and COVID in this moment. And so while we're seeing gains, we're also seeing sort of the flip side of those gains as well, and disparities in the impacts of how COVID is hitting our communities of color, our poorer communities in New York City. I guess if I were to think about or how to think about the sort of the bluer skies impact and whether we can make that a reality. I guess what it's doing is it's showing us what we can do when we come together. We all stayed home. We all, you know, have been working to come together for our fellow New Yorkers. And there's some really interesting corollaries for how we need to do similar things when it comes to our climate crisis. We need to be able to act more. There's certainly always going to be a policy need to be able to react to changes like this. And, you know, we're not going to solve our climate crisis just with individual actions. But it shows us and maybe points the way towards a better future and shows us that we actually can do these things when we do put our minds to it and come together. Again, it's not a great comparison. It's not like the exact way I would want to have done this, but it does show us, I think, a brighter future is possible if we do come together and actually listen to scientists and listen to public health officials on what's happening, and let our actions be guided by the science. And that's a really important point out of all this.
Very good points, Dan. And I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned the, you know, making decisions based on science, you know, very good foundation, which sometimes we don't see, which is a challenge. But I want to go back, and again, I want to thank Jan and you for your participation and for the wonderful presentation that you gave, giving us a very overall view of the challenges that we were struggling with before COVID. You know, that was something that we saw the activists really bringing this to the forefront in all the different forums in which the political and the economic kind of leaders came together. But my question is more related to what has been the impact of COVID-19 to your plan. You know, you released the new plan, you know, in April for Earth Day, and that was kind of the middle of our crisis. Do you have to adjust some of the plans and goals that you were putting forward as part of OneNYC 2050? And if not, how do you feel that now this challenge and this very difficult and impactful situation that we all encounter ourselves may have on the ability for the city to achieve those goals put forward in OneNYC 2050?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's a question that's being asked in this moment as the city's budget is being deliberated. And so there aren't necessarily specific answers to some of those questions right now, but it's, you know, there's a lot of things in our budget that are going to be impacted, and we don't quite know what that looks like. But we do know that it's, you know, we can't be penny wise and pound foolish about this either. And so there's a lot of conversations going on about what this plan looks like going forward. Remember, this is a plan putting forward a vision for 2050, but it's also the plan for what we do in this administration for the next 18 months. To make sure we can hand off a successful approach, you know, into the future and things can move on, because some of these problems are very much long-term in nature, whether it's the, you know, infrastructure we need to build, whether it's the, you know, the carbon emissions that need to be cut. So this may sound like an evasive answer, but it's only because we're still having some of those conversations in the budget right now. But it's been pretty clear that there are plenty of things that have impact that may not necessarily be budget related. And I think about things, at least on the city's budget, around Local Law 97 and the building retrofits that passed. You know, upgrading codes and standards over time, you know, ultimately saves money because of reduced energy use. And in the upfront near term, it's not a big capital investment to change codes and standards. Yes, things may cost some money differently in you know, out in the full private sector, but ultimately there's cost savings that come along with that as well, and financing. And then there's things like divestment, where we can use the power of our pension funds to make sure that we're, yes, spurring a transition and a just transition with our investments, and also protecting those investments at the same time. And so I think there's a number of things where we need to figure out in this new environment, you know, what are the the less budget heavy impacts that we can continue to pursue. But that doesn't mean we won't continue to invest. I think there's a continuing need to continue to pursue lots of different, whether it's heat mitigation and all the sort of resiliency investments, or the carbon cutting investments that need to happen. We just need to be smart and judicious about how we do that and how it fits in together. But again, the budget deliberations are going to answer a lot of those questions over the next, say, 2 months or so.
Daniel, we have a question from one of our, from the audience, the webinar audience. Interesting question from Miriam Fisher. She asks, can you talk about the resurgence of car culture as a consequence of fears about the use of the subway or other mass transit?
I think this is something that's on a lot of people's minds. This city works because of the subway system and because of its extensive mass transit system. It's really our lifeblood, and it's one of the reasons why New York City's greenhouse gas emissions per capita are about 1/3 of the national average. It's why we can have such density and job creation. So I can't speak on behalf of the MTA, and so I'm not going to try, but I think we need to figure out a way for that to be, that people we need to find a way for people to be comfortable using that system. But we also need to recognize that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of people that, for lots of different reasons are going to be just a little bit more leery of that. And, the more that we can do to create more sustainable mode shares on our streets, all of that I think is going to be really important. And it also puts a fine point on congestion pricing and the needs. As I understand it, there's still a need for the federal government to weigh in on the environmental impact review process that needs to happen to make that move forward. It feels like that's going to be even more important in this moment to make sure that we can keep this city, from totally collapsing on on our streets like that.
Thank you, Dan, for this answer. And again, as you can imagine, everybody's trying to think of what the future will be. What is the post-COVID world, the new normal? And there are two questions, one from Nancy Esema and from Grace Lynn, that is related more about what do you think are the priorities, particularly for building owners in terms of implementing the local laws and energy efficiency when we are thinking of COVID-19 and thinking about healthy buildings and energy efficiency. Has these ideas of the push forward in this area have changed because of COVID-19? It has increased or it has been reduced? So there is questions about that area.
Well, so I think there probably are a lot of questions out in the community around, commercial real estate and what the future of working and commuting is going to be. I have the feeling that we're going to see a lot more, people that can work from home. There's going to be more of that, and it's probably not going to be as extensive as it has been, but it might be more of an option for people. That we're probably going to see a lot more staggered schedules going forward to take some pressure off of the subway system and off the commuting times. But that doesn't undo the need for office space and for people to work together. I think we're going to do it in different socially distanced ways, whether that means spreading desks out a little bit more and taking advantage of the sort of staggered schedules. And but buildings are still going to need energy. They're still going to be using energy, and they're still going to be using energy that we need to be cleaner and cleaner going forward. So it's not a I don't think there's a clear answer yet on all of what this looks like. And some of it's going to depend on the psychology of everyone across New York City and their ability to commute and get back into the city in different ways. But it feels like it's going to be we're going to be definitely in a new normal for quite some time. And but I think what we haven't seen is a dramatic reduction in energy use, for instance. I think there's been shifting patterns. There's been more residential use than commercial use. But we are still putting greenhouse gas emissions out into the atmosphere, and that still has long-term repercussions to all of us. And so we now need to figure out the ways in which we can green our buildings, can green our energy supply, amidst this new complication of what the working world is going to look like and what the city and commuting patterns are going to look like. It's no easy challenge, and I don't think if anyone tells you they have all the answers to this right now, they're probably lying to you. I think we're going to be working to figure this out as we go. but we can't lose sight of one challenge because we're in the middle of another one. And I think New Yorkers can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can think about multiple problems at the same time, and in fact, we have to.
Daniel, we also have a person in our webinar audience, Christopher Diamond, who wants to ask, or who believes that there's a high probability of a power outage this summer, partly because of the increased number of window air conditioning units. And he wonders if the city is preparing for this kind of a double hit, where, in other words, we may be more at home than ever, not in our office buildings that have other kinds of cooling, using our home air conditioning units more.
No, and I can see, I certainly understand the concern there. And, the mayor has been focused on this as well, and thinking partly about the heat risks. So we know that heat kills more New Yorkers than any other natural hazard. And the way that it does that is pretty insidious in a lot of ways, that it's, it gets at people who are older, more vulnerable, at home, don't have anyone checking on them, and probably don't have an air conditioner or can't afford to use it. And so the mayor's been providing support for air conditioning. We've been working with the Public Service Commission and just the energy industry in general to get more support for seniors to be able to turn those on and get the cooling they need, because cooling centers and others, sort of the normal heat mitigation plans, need a rethink in this moment of social distancing. And so there's a lot of work in the city going on right now to make sure that we can protect New Yorkers in that, in that eventuality that we can see coming. And so to the point around, will that cause more energy use and cause a risk of a blackout? That's a big reason why we're working with Con Ed to make sure that, we have, that everyone is focused on this risk and heading that off and making sure we're putting the plans in place, and keeping our grid from, from going down in those moments when we most need it. Because we've seen that in the past in New York City. We've had outages, and I think by working with Con Ed and others, by seeing it coming, we can do everything we can to make sure that it doesn't become a reality.
Thank you, Dan. And I think that's one of the challenges. And you can imagine the people in the audience are thinking, about that future and the immediate impact and also the long-term impact. And you mentioned that you can see that the future may have some rethinking of the office spaces. Some people that may be able to work, telecommuting. That was the old word that we used to what we are doing right now. We are doing mass telecommuting. But people are thinking, like, if there are going to be a space available, because offices have been rethought and shrunk because of that kind of mixed workforce, in which some are working in the offices, some others are working remotely. Andres Espinal, one of the participants, asked, do you think that those office buildings that are not going to be occupied, what will be the best use of them later on? Should they be converted to housing? And how do you prepare for this adaptive reuse? Yeah,
I'm sure it's premature to be writing the obituaries on that real estate at this point. I think there's gonna be a lot of interesting things that come out of it, and we're going to see it over the next couple months, what that actually looks like as things start to restart, and how we do that in a way that's responsible, given that the virus isn't, there's no vaccine at this point. There's going to need to be a way to figure out how all this works, with masks, with social distancing. But I don't think that means that there's going to be, a dramatic sort of just giving up on, the industries that call New York City home. And that also doesn't take any strain off of our housing crisis that we have in New York City. And so, to the extent that there's some synergies between those two things, that might be an interesting thing to think through long term. But I don't think we are at all, this isn't the moment to say we're just going to convert our commercial spaces into all housing at this point. I think there's going to be a lot of creative solutions and a lot of ways that building owners think through how to make safe and healthy work environments, and that has to go in conjunction with the things like staggered schedules and other things that are going to happen, and making sure that our transit systems are serving all those people for getting around the city they need to. there's going to be a lot of changes. It's going to look a lot different. But I don't think it's going to just be like we don't have one, one set of things are going to go away and we're just going to fill it with some other thing. So all that to say is, again, anyone who thinks they have that crystal ball of what that looks like, let's come back and check on that in a year.
Daniel, I was really kind of taken by those startling numbers that you put up about sea level rise in New York City. And you were also kind of talking about the, interrelation of different possible emergencies, which it brought to mind. Here we come into hurricane season and thinking back to Sandy, and this summer could be quite dramatic in terms of, if people are still responding to the COVID emergency and might face hurricanes coming up the coast. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about your planning for this summer in that regard.
Well, I think this is something the entire nation needs to be more focused on. And I think we've seen NOAA has put out their projections for hurricanes this year. They're projecting it's going to be a more intense season than normal with a number of named storms. And I forget the exact numbers, but it's, a higher than average set of storms and named storms for the Atlantic Basin. Well, wherever that means it's likely that there will be hurricanes. They will make landfall, and cities, counties, regions, states will be grappling with exactly this question about whether it's shelter space and the kinds of things you need to do to prepare for and respond to a hurricane. In a world with COVID and social distancing in mind, those plans need to be rethought, and that's there's a lot of that work already going on. But I think we need also the federal government to be a big part of that. We're gonna, I'm sure FEMA is strained right now, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to be prepared for the kinds of things that we expect to see coming at us. And that may, of course, there's always a risk, knock on wood, that comes to New York City, but there's almost a certainty that that's going to come somewhere in this country.
Thank you, Dan. And one question that people, going back to the notion of the goals, the key themes that you presented in your NYC 2050. There are three particular elements: healthy lives, efficient mobility, and thriving neighborhoods, which you can see that correlates well to COVID-19 kind of approach to combat COVID-19. Do you believe that those sessions may have to be rethought as we learn more on the about COVID-19 and the post-COVID-19 new normal, or do you think that already incorporates some of the information that we have in our hands when you put this plan forward?
Well, I think there's a bit of both. There's always going to be, the world keeps changing on us, and we need to continue to adapt. And in fact, that's why the city's long-term strategic plan legislation requires every 4 years that we go through an assessment of our challenges, and the plan always evolves. So I think there's a natural process for that to happen here in New York City. And it also shines a real spotlight on some of the things that were being done here and the commitments for something like NYC Care and getting healthcare coverage to every New Yorker. I think we've seen how important that is to make sure that no one is fearful of the bill that is going to keep them from going and getting the care they need, whether it's COVID related or something else. Because as a city and probably as a region, all of our collective health is really dependent on the person who has the least health care in a lot of ways. And so making sure that New Yorkers have access to that healthcare need is something that we were focused on and prioritizing before this. And I think it's one of those things that has helped us because it's been able to make sure that all New Yorkers of, whatever their status, whatever their ability to pay, have been able to get testing, get care in this moment. And so things like that, I think the plan is very comprehensive in thinking about those sort of challenges and even talked about the public health risks that we face from infectious diseases like this. And which has has led us in a lot of ways to these things like the healthcare coverage for all New Yorkers. And I'm thinking about sort of like the thriving neighborhoods or the efficient mobility, all the things that we're going to be grappling with the subway system and bus service, and all the conversation that's happening around bikes in New York City right now. And it all points to we need to make sure that we can continue to be New York City and have the density that supports all of this lifestyle and efficiency and creative activity. All of that we need to make sure that we keep front and center in this recovery, because this is a place that people are still going to be in. This is a place where jobs are created. This is a place where the economy is driven from, and there's going to be no national recovery from this without a strong recovery in New York City.
We also have a question from one of our webinar participants named David Smiley. And he asks, are there any other cities, domestic or not, that you look to for good practices with respect to COVID-induced change?
It's a great question, because I think we we constantly ask ourselves this question outside of the COVID experience as well. And New York City traditionally puts a lot of work and effort into cultivating these sort of relationships city to city, and whether it's with some of our big mega city partners like a London or a Paris, or really all across the globe. And in this moment, C40 Cities has been a really important partner for us, and it's an organization of historically it's been driven by climate concerns, and it's been a network of mayors that want to take action on climate. But they in this moment have knowing that there's a need for cities all across the globe to think about COVID recovery, have really shifted their focus in the near term to help and support cities on this. And they've set up a task force of mayors that are all regularly convening on these shared challenges that we face from COVID and what it means, and have also, and this is the principles I put up on the slide earlier in the talk, C40 has helped craft a set of recovery principles that really put equity and health and sustainability at the heart of our recovery. And it's not only New York City, but about 36 other cities have signed on to those principles. And so whether it's thinking about the needs in our healthcare system, whether it's around transportation, and the need to continue to think through climate at the heart of this COVID recovery, these are the kind of things that I think cities all across the globe are really grappling with. And so we've been extensively engaging with them and sharing best practices and doing things like this, like these webinars, to learn from others across the globe. I think it's been really powerful because we can't just look inward in these moments. I think we have to look to our partners, whether it's in Milan or across Asia, or any of the cities that have been really grappling with this in London or across the US. It's there's a lot of lessons to be shared, and a lot of good thinking that's going on. And I think we're seeing it. We're seeing this experimentation of good ideas that I think a lot of other cities are going to be taking advantage of over the coming months and years.
But this just one little follow-up: is the C40, are that all United cities here in the U.S.?
No, it's a global organization.
Global.
It's about 100 cities from across the globe that we're all partnered with. And
is this like the same as 100 resilient cities?
It's not the same thing, and that's gone through a bit of an evolution of its own. But it's a network of some of the most well-known cities in the world, and coming together, and it's a mayor-led organization, so that it really is the concerns of mayors and cities that are driving the agenda, and which is why I think it's so important that they've put COVID at the heart of this conversation right now, and really thinking about how climate is part of that. But these shared concerns and the kinds of things we put forward in OneNYC are very much, a fully comprehensive strategic plan for cities. And I think we see more and more cities that are taking that sort of integrated approach to the challenges that we face. And that's been, I think, one of the powers of C40 at this moment, is to get those mayors together to share experiences.
Cool.
Thank you. And I following up on two comments that you made when you were answering Jan's question is first, talking about these kind of looking at other cities, how they're doing it. I just want to mention that 2 weeks from now, in June 9th, we have Chris Liban, who actually was the newsmaker of the year in ENR, and Jan knows him very well. He's going to be speaking June 9, and he's the Chief Sustainability Officer for LA Metro. And so we thought that was going to be good to have that conversation, to hearing from you as the Chief Climate Policy Advisor here in New York, and then bringing him to see some of the things that they are doing with respect to LA Metro and the Olympics and sustainability and how COVID-19 has affected it, so that you can see some of those comparisons and lessons learned. But at the same time, I also want to touch back on the issue of the C40. Again, great organization. I think Mayor Bloomberg was the chair of the C40 like maybe 2 years or 3 years ago, and Hidalgo, the mayor from Paris, was like a year or so ago. So there is a lot of participation from a lot of different mayors, and it's a very impactful organization. But you look at them, that they are, for example, some of the guidance that they are providing and sharing is to look at the issue of equity. And that whatever recovery we have, it takes into consideration the sustainability issues, but also equity. And there are two of the participants that ask questions related to this notion of equity. We have both, well, somebody that goes by the name of Cathedral of Science, and then somebody that, Neze Esima, who submitted a question in terms of knowing that a lot of the Black and Brown communities were the most affected by COVID-19, particularly here in New York. And you are talking about the kind of the restarting, revitalizing the investment on kind of the new Green New Deal. How do you think that that will be prioritized, the areas of those communities that have been hurt by the COVID-19? I know you mentioned some of the things about health, the health plan, NYC Care, but are there other issues that maybe could help the participant understand how comprehensive they look at this challenging issue will be?
Well, I think it's such an important question, and what we've seen here in New York City, and I think you would see this in many other cities, that the disparities and impacts from COVID that have particularly devastated our Black and Brown communities here in New York City. It's something that you can't just, obviously you can't put it aside. It has to be at the heart of how we think about the response to this, which is why the mayor has been so focused on this issue, putting forward as part of our long-term recovery, a race and equity commission that's led by the First Lady to really make sure that, all of the recovery programs that we're putting forward are focused and part of ending this tale of two cities that we are still very much a part of here in New York City. And, when you look at the maps of what, the things that impact New Yorkers in the most disparate ways, it's consistently the same map. It's consistently the same neighborhoods that are being impacted in Central Brooklyn, in the South Bronx, in Northern Manhattan. And there's just just decades of historic environmental injustice that is driving a lot of this. And this is a moment to address that, to really come past that. It's not all going to happen at once, obviously, but it's really important that we are making sure that environmental justice is a key component of the recovery here. And the mayor has been, in several of his public remarks already on the recovery, has been very focused on making sure that climate and environmental justice are a key component of this recovery. So there needs to be more on this. I think there needs to be a lot more on this, but I think it's we're going in the right direction, and putting the right focus on these disparities that we've seen from COVID.
Thank you. And I would like to thank both you and Jan for participating and having this wonderful conversation, and be able to bring the questions of the audience, which were very interesting, and your answers were very illuminating. I also would like to thank again the collaborating organization, ACEC New York, AIA New York, ASCE, CMAA New York, New Jersey, ENR, and NAC. Thanks to my colleagues at Columbia who helped put this together. You mentioned some of them, Dan, Rick Bell, Charles Cheng, and Michael Smith. Without them, this will not be possible. And I also would like to thank to all the different participants for being here and to be part of this conversation. Next Tuesday, June 2nd, we will have from noon to 1 our fourth lecture in the series. Our guest speaker is going to be King Yao, the Partner and Architecture Research Office, ARO, and 2020 President of the American Institute of Architects New York chapter. My co-moderator and respondent for that lecture will be Benjamin Prosky, Executive Director of AIA New York and the Center for Architecture. And as I mentioned, on the fifth lecture on Tuesday, June 9, again from noon to 1, the speaker will be Chris Liban, Chief Sustainability Officer for the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And my co-moderator and respondent will be Tom Smith, the Executive Director of AEC, who is going to be there. So I would like to thank all of you for participating, and thank you, Dan, thank you, Jan, for making this such a wonderful conversation and lecture. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.